Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. You've made it to episode 5, and today we're asking why we call the period Gilded and Progressive. In 1873, Mark Twain and Dudley Warner wrote the book The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, which is a satire of the nouveau riche, political corruption, as well as immigration and assimilation. Only later did historians like Lewis Mumford and Van Wyck Brooks take up the term gilded to describe the late 19th century as excessively materialistic, greedy, and morally corrupt. The period stood in contrast to the progressive movements they observed in the early 20th century, even though these progressives had begun long before the 20th century. It's safe to say that there is plenty of disagreement about what we should call this period of American history, or whether it needs a name at all. The 1870s to 1920s have been called many things other than gilded or progressive. Mumford called it the Brown Decades, which is perhaps the gloomiest of descriptions. Historian Richard Hofstadter called it the Age of Reform, and his mid-century colleague Robert Wiebe called it the Search for Order. American Studies founder Vernon Parrington called it a huge barbecue, or as H. Wayne Morgan read it, the Feast of Material Plenty. Other scholars like Alan Trachtenberg called it the Incorporation of America, and Rebecca Edwards agreed that it should be called the Age of Incorporation to mark the scale of the period's enterprises. More recently, historians have tethered the Gilded Age to Reconstruction, perhaps most notably Jackson Lears, who considers it a psychological rebirth of the nation after the Civil War. Nancy Cohen called it the Reconstruction of American Liberalism. There are naturally omissions and occlusions with all of these varieties. How can we call it the Age of Reform when reform happens all the time? How can we focus on progress and evolution when that trajectory was not experienced by everyone or even the majority of Americans? Where is the recognition of the wider world and global trends of the time? And if we focus squarely on business and corporate growth, do we seek a usable past that helps us fit with the current context? Where in these monikers can we find women, minorities, immigrants, Native Americans, children, environmental history, or the many other perspectives that the historical record so regularly diminishes? Have we left out histories of agriculture, of industry, or politics and populism? Or have we spent too much time on these or other aspects of the past? And if the Civil War is so important, does such a lens mute postbellum experiences as secondary? This is an existential minefield for those of us that study the period, and today we'll examine the terminology we use to define our field of study and ask if it's fit for purpose. And I'm joined today by two leading experts, and I can say this with confidence because they have literally written the book or edited the book called A Companion to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Today I'm joined by Professor of History at Santa Clara University, Nancy Unger, and Professor Christopher McKnight Nichols, the Director of the Center for the Humanities at Oregon State University. Each are distinguished scholars. Professor Unger has written extensively on women and progressive leaders Bob and Belle La Follette. Professor Nichols is an expert on American foreign relations and has already joined me to talk about the 1918 influenza. But along with their astonishing solo work, there is this collaboration that they've worked on as editors. It's a remarkable book called A Companion to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and it includes some 20 chapters on all aspects of the period. You both are very welcome to the show. Thanks for coming.
Let's do it. Sounds good.
And Mike, there was a lot of call in the society during COVID for some kind of content. What can we do? People are really looking for community. They're looking for this type of thing. And we sponsored two book events that were very well attended. So I think that this is going to tap into. It's not like, oh my God, another thing. It's like, yes, we're looking for this kind of community.
Thanks so much, Nancy. And the society is the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. That Gilded Age bit came from Mark Twain. And we start off with Twain and Dudley Warner and their book, The Gilded Age, as a starting point for the conversation?
We're pretty quick to dismiss the Twain and Warner Gilded Age book, helping to give rise to that nomenclature. But corruption was a really central way that people experienced that era and the gilding of things in the way that they intended it. and also the kind of optimism and speculative, like sort of future of democracy in that book, which otherwise is ponderous and isn't particularly good, right? Which is why we kind of reject it in some ways, actually does get at what then gets you to the progressive era, that kind of faith in progress, that there's something really to redeem, that corruption isn't endemic in American democracy, but rather a kind of original sin, even like slavery, that you can push beyond, presumably or hopefully through meaningful reform. So the gilding there can do a lot of work metaphorically, historically.
It's interesting to me, progressive era is the one that my students have trouble with. The Gilded Age concept is one they can get pretty quickly. But progressive, what does that mean? I mean, it's so broad. It's problematic in its own ways. I've for years taught a seminar on the progressive era and an upper division course, and I finally have had to change their names. I now call my seminar The Making of Modern America, 1877 to 1920. And the upper division course is U.S. Turmoil and Reform, 1887 to 1920. Because, progressive era, just, what does that mean unless you have some sense of this? It doesn't, it can mean anything for any period. I mean, of course, those things I just said, turmoil and reform, can go for any period as well, which is why you have to put the dates in, which of course becomes problematic in its own way.
So that's something that I really wanted to start off by asking both of you. That's the number one question that I have on my mind. If we put aside for a moment the name, and I just ask you, when is the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and is it two periods of time, or is it one long period of time?
Chris, you want to take this one first? I have strong thoughts on this. Go ahead.
Oh, well, then I want you to go first. If you got strong thoughts, please.
I think that it is frustrating to me that for so long it was perceived as two periods, and it's got this confusing name, because for me it is one long period, and it's not like there's the Gilded Age followed by the Progressive Era. It's like this double helix it's always responding to each other. The two aspects of this are always in conversation or resistance or whatever. So for me, there's no question that it is just one long period, and I think, wouldn't you two say that that's pretty much the consensus? Or
I would say that it is generally, and it's a question of either where you put the boundaries on that, or when you make the switch from kind of reform impulses that precede formal progressivism to progressive reformers and their reform aims in all the multiple progressivisms, and rather than one singular progressivism, which is certainly the consensus. No one is searching for the real or authentic progressives or progressivism as the old historiography did, which had plenty of merits. Don't get me wrong there, but it's much more in the plural, and therefore fits nicely with your one long era kind of sensibility. I think policing the boundaries of historical eras is really a fool's errand. I mean, is it 1860 and the Civil War? That's what Heather Cox Richardson is suggesting in her chapter in our book. Reconstructing the Gilded Age and Progressive Era really goes 1860 to 1920, so post World War I. That seems fine to me. I'm willing to endorse that, but I could also, go with the end of Reconstruction or somewhere in the midst of Reconstruction. Again, the choice there is interesting. What I think as a historian, the choice there is interesting because it helps us get at the themes and trends, right? So Nancy, you're right. If it's one era, then when do we want to start? When's our springboard? And what are the core themes and arguments we want to have spring from that? Is it disillusion, destruction, and the Civil War? Is it the reconstitution and reconstructing the nation state that came after? Is it sometime after that, the failures of Reconstruction? So kind of lost promise first of Reconstruction, then lost promise of progressivism fundamentally by the end of that period. The themes you choose, this gets at your point about utility, Nancy, the themes that you choose then dictate some of the periodization. But I think an arbitrary boundary between a Gilded Age and Progressive Era makes no sense to me.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. And I think we really have to plug that chapter in your book, Heather Cox Richardson's chapter about reconstituting the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, because she has a couple of really nice turns of phrases around what we as historians do as lumpers or splitters. Do we lump periods together? Do we split them up? But also then she kind of finishes with, do we simply just drop the Gilded Age bit? I mean, how do you feel about that? Just taking the Gilded Age out of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era?
I'm not a fan, because, like I said, first of all, that's a concept that, like it or hate it, people understand, and I think it does begin the conversations that we want to have. And if we don't have that, if we have, what is it, Reconstruction and the Progressive Era is what she's hoping that this will become, and that. I don't know, that just doesn't fly for me, again, because the progressive era is so can mean anything. I think we need that Gilded Age in there to anchor it. I've never seen it as problematic. And so for me, what was interesting about her essay was more starting in Reconstruction. And for me, that just makes too long a period. And I know that we do put in these artificial sort of, time frames and so forth. But ultimately, if otherwise you just have chaos. And I think when you're presenting this and acknowledging that these are sort of artificial limits, you have to start somewhere. This is one of the things that I really love about teaching this period is we spend, or even when I'm writing about it, you always have to kind of start by defining your terms. And I think that's a healthy and worthwhile conversation. So I'm with you, Chris. I mean, I don't have any big opposition to any of this stuff, but I do think that the name that she's given for me is too generic, and the period is so broad that, and certainly there are themes that go across. But you can say that about any period in American history, throughout American history. So anyway, that's my first sort of thought on this.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add, on the Gilded Age piece and the gilded element, one of the things that people were talking about in this recent exchange on Twitter, and one of the directions that scholarship has been headed for at least a decade is, history of capitalism. And whether or not Twain and Warner in their Gilded Age book intended to critique sort of the broader parameters of capitalism, or more narrowly speculation, corruption, and political systems, we can pull that out of using the term gilded, right? So that's what the metaphor can help us do in the best sort of American studies or literary studies sense, and I think that's useful. So I'd like to keep gilded. I mean, even if it's a subhead rather than the topical nomenclature, I'd like to keep gilded in there, because it gets to some really core and important themes of the era. And if you want to go back to Heather's piece, which is great, what are some of the failures of Reconstruction? Well, all of the arguably, corruption related dimensions of Southern politics that disenfranchise African Americans are in some ways about who's gilding what, and then who's benefiting from the graft, right? And you see that in the North too. Let's not, so you could think about ballot stuffing, Tammany, et cetera. We could go down a whole long list of these sort of gilded dimensions of the era that I think really get at fundamental questions. This gets to your core point, Nancy, and I think why we're talking about this, Mike, the world we live in today, right? That corruption, graft, the 1%, an imperfect at best democracy, a fatally flawed one at worst, right? That is very much in there with the gilded. When you get below what's gilded, what's in there? Rot, decomposition, right? Something pretty nasty is under that gilded sphere or cover or whatever.
I think that's great, because I think what Heather's article really centers on is the idea of citizenship. And you can see that in democracy. You can see it in the problems that we're facing today with corruption, or even Tammany back then. But what I didn't think it got at was some of the more socio-cultural events that happened in the Gilded Age that we think so much about. I know I teach about the Bradley Martin Ball when I want to talk about the Gilded Age, and about how excess kind of displays itself in that period in a way that it might in other periods. But just the idea of citizenship being the focal point seems to distract from maybe capitalism, or maybe some of these other socio-cultural factors like the rise of consumerism, the sexual revolution that's happening, and the development of a global America. And this is where I wanted to propose something not that controversial, but maybe more along lines that I'm more familiar with, which is foreign policy. And maybe we could talk more about foreign policy, because one of the things that happens here is the globalizing of America, or as Frank Ninkovich said, global dawn. And I know you've talked about in your own writing, Chris. Paul Kramer has got a definition of empire as asymmetrical power dynamics. that that I think is really useful because it creates new spatial orders like the railroads did, new interpersonal relationships, new hierarchies of power, and new modes of exploitation that weren't there before the Gilded Age. And I think that's something that we might entertain more in the dialogue about the Gilded Age, is that there's this global aspect to it, and there's a foreign policy aspect to it, perhaps.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think one of the things that Nancy and I tried to do in putting together our Gilded Age book was to emphasize that those international dimensions more than a lot of other kind of state of the field projects have done. So we have a great chapter by Ian Terrell, among others, and he talks about those circuits of connection. He's talked about this in his other work too, networks and circuits in this era, and how they work at multiple levels. So there's institutional circuits and connections and conferences. You can think about that with missionaries. There's individuals going out in the world, European tours, or young progressive reformers. I mean, when I first started studying this, I was just struck by how many people studied in Germany, and they got their ideas from European, social democrats. I mean, the progressives of the U.S. were, Dan Rogers-esque, like absolutely invested in Atlantic crossings, and really more global dimensions too. Atlantic doesn't give it due justice because there's folks in the Pacific, there's people in Africa, right? Americans are out there in the world in the latter half of the 19th century in really profound and important ways, in ways that we really miss when we simplify down to that, at least that the language of just Gilded Age and Progressive Era, because the international dimensions are so critically important. I mean, we could spend the whole podcast talking about those. And I think, I don't know to what extent Nancy would want to talk about this, but if you think about conservation and environmental movements, they're both continental in nature and thinking about, limited resources, but also have this global scope, which I don't know that we've really reckoned with, because we're in the midst of another kind of global moment of crisis. It wasn't the same crisis in the late 19th century, but I'm not sure if that's a direction you'd want to go in thinking about this, Nancy.
Well, I'm still processing what you were just talking about, and I think that I wrote a little piece about Bob La Follette going to Europe in 1923, and when he's on the ship going over there, he's one of, I think, 5 or 6 senators. Because they're all, going to, he says, I went to learn and so forth. So I guess my point, and this may seem a little, maybe I'm trying too hard, but I see this very squarely in this notion of Gilded Age. On the one hand, we have, look, all these Americans are going all these places, you say, as missionaries, doing all these different things, politicians and so on. But even there, it's like, well, if you scratch off that gold surface, what lurks underneath? What are the other meanings this could possibly have? So to me, I agree that for way too long, Gilded Age and Progressive Era was sort of presented and taught primarily as sort of this domestic movement, and then World War I comes along and ends it. And there might be a little bit about what happened in Mexico with Wilson, or a few other Latin American things and so forth. But not a great deal. And I think we've certainly gone way beyond that. But to get back to our original question, I don't think that that's antithetical. I don't think that excludes this notion of Gilded Age. I think it's another reason for me why it works as a title. Now, I think that would work as a title in virtually any period. But since we have sort of cornered the market on it, I'm happy to keep it that way.
I'm glad too, because the podcast obviously bears the name, and it's going to save me some serious rebranding. But I think your point about it being parochial, is that something that was past tense, or is it something that we can avoid? Because if we think about other places too, France has their Belle Epoque. The Japanese history books kind of tend to go by imperial generations. There's other places, Edwardian, you can think of, or the French have fin de siècle. I mean, is this a natural tendency, a parochial tendency, to think of, your history in these terms?
Yeah, it probably is. I think, let's just focus on our era for one moment more. So maybe the whole rest of the podcast. Something fundamentally different, to my mind as a historian, was going on in the late 19th and early 20th century. That's why I'm so attracted to the period. And you find that in quotes at every level of society. You find that in people's memoirs. You find it in presidents and secretaries of states. And you find that across nation states too. So what was going on? Well, modernization, urbanization, right? Industrialization. The U.S. goes, in 1880, the census says the U.S. is majority rural. In 1920, the U.S. is majority urban, right? So the those patterns, those transformations are enormous. And then, Henry George famously says, it's like the era of haves and have-nots in poverty and progress, or progress and poverty rather. And you see that in lots of other societies, trying to work out those insoluble questions about the transformation to become modern, which Nancy's retitled her class around, I think is why it's attractive to us in some ways, and why we seek a kind of language to describe or demarcate the era, because it is demonstrably different in the experience of people living through it and in the patterns we can discern from it, right? Something has changed. In 1869, when people are rushing across the US to complete a transcontinental railroad, that changes things. In the late 1870s, when Edison is patenting light bulbs, I mean, think about what's possible after you have light bulbs. I mean, it's just transformative of everything in society. And then, coming to cities and all the squalor and as bad as cities are, they're super attractive to human beings. And then reformers have to figure out, well, how do you make it more attractive? How do you build parks? How do you make it healthy and safe and all that stuff, right? We can go on and on with this, but something fundamentally different is going on in that era, which I think is why a lot of the language you were just describing talks about broadly that period.
Yeah, and just to support what you're saying, I was rereading Rebecca Edwards' essay, Politics, Social Movements, and the Periodization of U.S. History. And she says, well, we can take it all the way up to 1929. The Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And she says, in this way, we could include Bob La Follett's independent bid for the presidency in 1924. Well, I'm all about Bob La Follette all the time, but even I can't go that far. It's done. That unique period that you're talking about, Chris, even though it's hard for us to really, but for me, no, 24 does not do it. For me, this is going to pretty much end with World War I, because it's the end of that sort of, we're going to make the world safe for democracy, that kind of, idealism and so forth. So I'm getting us a little far afield here, but I did want to support this notion that, yes, I don't think it's just, any years will do and sort of any name will do. It is a discrete, important period. And that's why those of us who have devoted our lives to studying it have done so, because it's not just, it's sort of part of a continuum. No, it's this unique thing. I think you're exactly right about that.
I buy that. And I think your point of Rebecca is actually great. If you think about her work broadly, she has this great book, New Spirits, which I've taught with and worked really well. And that demarcates the New Spirits era broadly as 1865 to 1905. Mm-hmm. So you can see us all trying to slice this and track the patterns, right? Make some slightly different choices about when and where they end and begin. But I guess I would argue that those slight moments of difference actually illuminate how much similarity we have here. Now, maybe it's groupthink, but maybe it is coming out of the historical record and the kind of questions that we historians are asking.
Yeah. If I can go back to 1920, though, Nancy, I have to agree with you entirely, because for me, that election in 1920, after the First World War, for me, is just the end of that internationalist attitude that the world has. So again, maybe I'm thinking with that foreign policy experience, but Warren Harding was the least like Theodore Roosevelt out of any of the Republicans that were running, and that's it for the League of Nations. And for me, everything changes after that. I mean, even Harding's idea of normalcy seems like an end to that period. And I know, Chris, you've written extensively about isolationism and the internationalist underpinnings of all that, actually, but in some ways it's still isolationist to a degree. And I know that opens up a lot of conversations in among diplomatic historians who say, well, isolation isn't a thing, and some say it is, and in veiled guises and whatnot. But it does say a lot about, I think, where the fault lines are in the things that we're discussing and the conversations that we're having with each other. But it has, I think, also importance for those people that don't get into the nitty gritty conversations about the words and the fault lines. How can we reach out to those people that are maybe more the general public, those ones that are going to pick up a trade book about the Gilded Age and Progressive Era? What can we say to them about why this period matters as a distinct one?
Well, to me, I mean, we're all historians. And for me, I'm a historian because why would you reinvent the wheel? If there's a problem today, you want to look to the past to say, okay, what is it similar? What worked then? What didn't work? Why? You, as I say, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. History is not intellectual masturbation. It's actually a very useful tool for dealing with the realities of the present day. So for me, one of the things that is just, this is just a cliche, but I do believe there are so many echoes today of the past, looking at, the industrial statesman versus robber baron argument. We can have that today. We used to have it about, John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. You can have it today about Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. Is Starbucks, is this a great and wonderful thing that we can get our coffee this way, or is this terrible because it's pushing out the ma and pa? There are so many things that to me, it's just such, yes, it's overwhelming to live in 2021 and look at these overwhelming problems and issues until you look back and say, oh, here's a generation that had in many ways similar types of overwhelming problems. How did they handle this? How did they look at it? What reforms did they try to institute? What worked? What didn't work? To me, this is, this is, why wouldn't you be doing this? I'm very happy the Washington Post has this Made by History, and Chris, I believe you're one of the co-editors of that. And I think it's a wonderful way to introduce people into thinking about learning how the past can really illuminate the present. And the period that we all agree actually existed, this Gilded Age and Progressive Era, I think is particularly valuable today. So that's my thought.
I completely buy everything you just said. I co-sign it. Yes, I agree, Nancy. I guess I'll tackle slightly the beginning of your question, Mike, since Nancy's done such a good job about why we should study the period, which is about that rupture in 1920 and 1919. Maureen Flanagan has a book on progressivism, and she talks about that the destination was progressive society and the roads and the travelers were diverse, is sort of how she puts it in the preface or the introduction. And by 1919, 1920, you've had so many changes. So you think about income tax, which have been debated and pushed around in American politics since the origins, right? And shifting from kind of vice taxation and tariffs to income taxation is enormous. Direct election of senators is maybe one of the most transformational things we don't ever think about in our current era. That this is all happening there in the late, progressive era before 1919, before 1920, and then women get the vote. And then you don't see much more of the kinds of reform ethos and rhetorics. You do see some, right? And so historians like to say, progressivism doesn't all end after 1920, and progressive reform does endure. You've got Bob La Follette, who's Nancy's written brilliantly about, and others on the scene. You've still got Eugene Debs kicking around the Socialist Party, but there's none of the same, really enormous impulse. A lot of the achievements have happened there, especially sort of at an apex in the 1910s. Then you get the war. And one thing we didn't used to think as much about, and then you get the flu pandemic, right? And 675,000 Americans die, many more injured or have irreparable lung damage. And so the 20s, it shouldn't surprise us. The US is pulling back and things are changing in domestic and foreign policy. It shouldn't surprise us coming out of all of that there have been some, if the destination was a kind of progressive society, kind of paraphrasing from Maureen Flanagan, then enough of that has been achieved that some people are willing to rest in their laurels and others want to co-opt that or actually push back against that, right? And so you see some of the Republican normalcy policies of the 20s as, Coolidge, right? The business of America is business. That is also antithetical to some of the ways in which, and I'm not even talking about sort of serious reformers, on the far left, but some of the kind of moderates of the TR and his first two administrations would not have wanted that orientation in the 20s, right? So you see some real pushback in that era. And I think that's also illuminating, back to Nancy's point, why do we study this? You might say the bookend to the progressive era is also really worth studying: the rise of inequality, racial injustice, the rise of the Klan, or new forms of it, right? This is also the world we live in today in this pandemic. And so whatever the achievements were that came before, that pushback was incredibly successful and normalized in many ways. And if it weren't for the Depression, who's to say that wouldn't have become an even more dominant way of thinking about organizing American society, a kind of xenophobic, inward-looking kind of corporate capitalism with a 1% that's incredibly well off and running things, a kind of oligarchic system that many critics today see aborting or already see in full efflorescence.
I think we're getting somewhere now. I think this is really interesting. Ruth Bader Ginsburg once said that the emblem of the United States should be a pendulum. And that might help us with the idea of periodization somewhat too, because you're right, you have this swing in 1920 in some ways, maybe not in all ways, as we've said, maybe other aspects of society and culture, swung at a later stage or in a different trajectory. But we do have this swing that leaves us with a different society. I mean, prohibition is one way. You can just think for the average person living in 1920, it was just markedly different to what it would have been like beforehand. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways, and I think we are getting somewhere with this, which is great, because that's the big hope. I guess the thing that I was wondering most of is what we're saying here is that this doesn't have to be a zero-sum pursuit. And this goes back to what the journalism professor Richard John was writing on Twitter, but also in the journal, the Gilded Age and Progressive Era Journal. He says that it's the only period that is unambiguously pejorative. But I suppose, what I wonder is he getting at is, can the period be both gilded and progressive at the same time? Plutocratic and populist, corrupt and crusading. That's probably truer to life, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't see how those are in any way mutually exclusive. I mean, as I said, that the double helix image is what works best for me. That we have these Gilded Age excesses. We have progressive reformers trying to remedy those. We see there's pushback, the pushback that Chris is talking about, that is happening throughout the era, of course, not just at the end. So I see that. That's one of the reasons why, as sort of cumbersome and clumsy as that title is, for me, it does work, because it is very clear that both of those things are going on. And we haven't talked about this, and I know it doesn't matter that much, but one of the big problems. So I was surprised to read in Heather Cox Richards' essay, I'd forgotten this, that she said that when the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era were forming the society in 1988, only 49 out of 97 supported the title of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And they had other options. Historians of the early modern era. Well, early modern, what does that mean to most people? Although that's the term that I actually have to use, because that's what gets, making of America, that time of thing. Emerging historians of emerging modern America. And both of them, the span was 1865 to 1917. So one of my problems with the Society for Historians of Gilded Age Progressive Era, the acronym is SHAPE, which always makes me sound like I'm drunk. And I'm president of this organization. I'm the president of SHAPE. I wish we'd come up with something that just had a better acronym. But in any event, I'm getting kind of out into the weeds here. But I don't think it's at all problematic that these two things in tension are very much part of the title. I think that's very fitting.
Yeah, with all due respect to Richard John, I don't think it's unambiguously pejorative at all. I mean, why I'm attracted to the era is the idealism, the optimism, some of the transcendent figures from every background and across the political spectrum, from grassroots folks to the highest politicians, literary figures, philosophers. I mean, it's such a vibrant period. Now, I know historians say that about their eras, right? To some extent, that there's something we all find that gives us some hope. Otherwise, we'd just be these despairing scholars in our monastic cells. But, so for me, it's definitely not unambiguously pejorative. And, so many people center their analysis. Richardson does. Robert Johnston has a great essay, I think one of the most read ones in the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, on redemocratizing the era. And his several big historiographic essays are all about kind of the democratic politics in the era. And sort of centering on questions of democracy. But within that, it's about these idealistic figures who want to make American democracy better, and those who are kind of regressive or atavistic figures who want to make it arguably worse, different, go back to white male landowners kind of vision of American democracy. And, so I see that as the essential kind of, if it's a pendulum, in this essential set of contestations in American society and politics, and maybe in lots of other societies too, but just locating on the United States, that is really has high and low moments, which are fascinating and wonderful, and certainly not unambiguously pejorative, in my opinion. I mean, I think you can find some of the most inspiring figures in U.S. history in this era. I mean, Ida B. Wells, Barnett. When I remember learning about her when I first got to college, and I was like, oh my God, how did I not know about this pioneering woman? Figuring out lynching, constantly under death threats. I mean, wow, amazing. Du Bois, we know about. William James, arguably the greatest American philosopher. From varieties of religious experience to pragmatism, like deeply inflects how I think about things. I mean, just and on. We could go through so many of these figures, right? But I mean, I've written a lot about Jane Addams and Emily Balch. I mean, if these figures don't get you inspired about trying to end world wars, I don't know what will, right? I mean, wow, right?
I just have to interject quickly. Belle LaFollette at one point said, "What custom could be more barbarous than a 10-course dinner?" And, just this whole notion of how, so many women were expected to spend their time. I mean, I think that should be cross-stitched on, I don't know, someplace. I just thought it was brilliant. So I think all three of us can come up, as Chris says, with all of these different, inspiring people and so forth. And I think that I remember when my LaFollette biography first came out, a young man wrote to me from the University of Wisconsin and said, this book came out in 2000. He said, he was so depressed about the world and how things were going. He said he just pulled it off the shelf, sat down in the library, read it in one sitting. And he said, I came out with my moral gas tank on full because it showed me that people can inspire others. They can make positive change. I mean, I think that a period that is really able to do that. And as Chris says, probably all periods have aspects of that, but ours is just, there's a lot of low hanging fruit there because it's, so anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Michael, you were going to say something.
No, I was actually gonna ask you about La Follette because and both Belle and Bob, because they're complex characters, and I think getting to what Chris is saying about the complexities of the age, you can see this in people like Du Bois, in Twain, in the La Follettes, and in Theodore Roosevelt. The folks that we're writing about, and that part of the history, like you say, yes, you can pick out characters from the past, and we all have colleagues that work on early modern Britain or imperial Japan, and they have their interesting characters too. But they also say, this is my distinct, turf. This is my area that I'm milling, and it's really unique and important, and this is why. And I think we're sort of setting out our stall in the same way, which is why I think we're in agreement that the Gilded Age and Progressive Era has to stay as the moniker, right? I mean, that's it.
I like I said, I changed the titles of my classes because my students were not getting this. It's more of an inside title, I think, among historians. And then it like I say, I kind of like it because then I have to explain, what these terms mean and why. That is my only concern about it. I mean, if you say, I'm going to teach a course on the revolutionary period in American history, everybody knows what you mean, even though this is not revolutionary for enslaved African Americans, for Native Americans, for women who can't vote. Well, I mean, it's got all kinds of problems, but that title works. So in some ways, I don't think this title is any more problematic than any other title that is given. If you start picking apart, the triumph of Jacksonian democracy, well, again, for who? For Native Americans, for women. So, if you're going to have a little short, title, it's going to be problematic no matter what. And I think in some ways, ours is a little bit more problematic in some aspects of it. In other ways, I like that because it gets you going on the whole complexity of the period from the get-go.
Yeah, I think that's for me, that's the selling point, is that it's metaphoric. And even going back to what we were saying about it being pejorative, actually, gilding still has a very shiny and rich exterior. And so, it has that element of gold, even if it's not the real thing. So as a metaphor, I think it works really well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that fits. Everything that we're saying does seem to connect to the early sort of the 1870s moment, and that's an 1873 book, the Warner and Twain book, to think about corruption, speculation, haves and have-nots, the kinds of reorganization of capitalism in the US, the reorganization of social lives, what it means to work, how to identify as an individual within a family unit, right? What larger communities were doing. That Robert Wiebe used to talk about island communities and the dissolution of island communities, that there were once communities that just sat out there, say in the real and imagined heartland of the US. And then those island communities get punctured by traveling to cities and different kinds of connections, but also by modern technologies. So you can, by the end of the period, you could connect by phone, right? I think that a lot of those things fit there really neatly. I mean, I think the challenge for us, if you take the 30,000 foot view, is the Gilded Age and Progressive Era seem like flyover country between a really important war and another really important war. And then the latter one is a question of emphasis. Is it World War I or World War II? And World War I is often less well known, certainly for Americans, right? So it's interesting to me. One of the things we haven't quite picked on is how many people end the Gilded Age and Progressive Era in 1917. And how many go to 1920 or a little bit later, right? I mean, some are pushing it to 29. I don't think that quite works. But if you want, from my view, you need to get World War I in there to kind of culminate that moment. And in part because of the intellectuals I've studied from that period. So lots of the progressive reformers who are arguing about those 1870s kinds of questions about, what does a modern industrial society have at stake in citizenship questions, in the world, in reconstructing corporate capitalism and moderating it. And then they wind up being Wilsonians, right? And they support these people like, Lippmann and Crawley, and they wind up supporting the Wilsonian project, hook, line, and sinker. They buy it, right? They're all in. And then they suddenly see, as Randolph Bourne sort of said, scales fall from their eyes because they see what the wartime state could become, this, hyper-patriotic, propagandizing, modern bureaucracy that really kind of, in Jamesian terms, kind of was like a juggernaut car running over people, right? And as in, one example, back to the flu, we're living in a pandemic now. Wilson never once publicly talked about the flu, right? This purported progressive who cared about people and reform, right, doesn't make those kinds of moves. That's the wartime context, and that's some of the ways in which you can see the ruptures in progressivism in that era. Real progressive intellectuals buying into the war, and then the kind of collapse there at the end. And I think that fits with what Morgan was talking about in terms of the beginning part of that sort of the set of trends that you see moving over time, haves and have-nots. That question gets sublimated to the state and kind of existential crisis in a war, and the possibility, this really alluring possibility of transforming the world, right? Making the world safe for democracy, building lots of democracies in other places, casting off monarchy. And then having been seduced by that, a lot of these intellectuals then in the 20s are, step back and they become major cultural critics, or H.L. Mencken types, right? They're throwing bombs at a lot of elements of American society after that, having realized that they bought into a project that they really should have found antithetical to the kind of ideals that they believed in.
Well, Du Bois too. I mean, Du Bois eventually comes to support the war, so it's incredible. You're right. The intellectual thought that kind of coalesces on that moment. And for me, I think I really wonder what you guys think about this in terms of interdisciplinarity, because one of the things that we do is we have a set of sources that we tend to go to as historians. They're usually in archives, but interdisciplinarity offers so much for this period. And I mentioned we're talking about Twain, so literature is obviously the go-to thing. And I know that other people are talking about business and capitalism. There's a bunch of really fascinating interdisciplinary avenues to follow in this era. I'll just share with you mine, but I'd love to hear what you think would be really exciting avenues. I totally nerd out on the efficiency movement and on standardization, industrial standardization, like bolts. How many threads are going to be on a bolt, or what actually defines whiskey as a thing? No one else finds that exciting. I could read thousands of pages of testimony from people in those industries about why you need to have 1/3 of an inch bolt, sizes or whatever. What is it for you that you think are some really exciting avenues that we can, delve a little deeper into this period, be at different disciplines?
Well, I'll tackle a couple. So one dimension that I think is really fascinating, and maybe this is also like you, Mike, nerding out, is legal questions. I think there's been a lot on law in the progressive era, the role of jurists, in the rise of international law. One of the things that fascinated me when I first started studying it, and then there's been some essays, and there's a chapter in Frank Ninkovich's book on Global Dawn on this international copyright law, which is fascinating in this period. And the really short version of one takeaway is that Americans in the late 19th century are really insecure. And so they don't think that they're producing much of that much value, and they kind of want to pirate what other people are doing. And then all of a sudden, by the end of the period, they want to secure their copyrights. People are reading American things out in the world. They want those patents to be protected. And so there's a real shift there in that era in assertions of copyright law and the way that it operates in a global and in a national context, which I think is really fascinating. I mean, for me, teaching the period, I love doing the art. Love doing political cartoons. You can unpack them in so many different ways. And again, this also taps into this insecurity. One of the abiding questions in literary journals and newspapers in the era is there anything great in American art and literature? And they trot out their Henry Jameses, and they try to make these claims to James Fenimore Cooper, being like these fantastic, writers. But the reality is Americans really think that they're second or third rate producers of culture in the early part of this period.
All right. Well, this is not exactly new, but one of the books that I teach is Amusing the Million, James Cason's book on basically on Coney Island during this period. And it's this short little book, but it really gets my students going, and we really start talking about the power of leisure and this new notion that people, including working class people, actually have time and a little discretionary income, and what you do with that and how that is spent, and the rise of professional baseball. And I mean, I think this is something that really gets people excited, interested, and it does what I think all of us really want. It gets you thinking about your own use of leisure time, energy, your discretionary income. Where does that go? What does it mean today that computer games are outselling movies? Just all these kinds of questions. So I think I would like to see more done on this, and certainly there's been plenty done on plays, literature, and not the high literature, but the popular literature. What are people buying to read, that kind of stuff. So I think I'd like to see more on leisure and its importance, not just the high culture, but much more in popular culture.
I have a thought here, Mike, on the nomenclature of the era too, and interdisciplinarity. So one thing that's been frustrating for those of us involved with the Society for Historians for the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and Nancy can speak to this as president of the society, is that so many historians don't identify with the period, right? Their work may significantly overlap with the period. They may be making cutting edge innovations in the scholarship of the era, but in fact, they see themselves primarily as 19th century historians or Civil War historians, or people who work on race or indigenous folks or women and gender studies. Pick your example, right? Any subfield. So there's that. And then there's an added dimension in interdisciplinary work, which is that, most other fields don't periodize this era this way, right? So modernist studies in literature extends much farther and begins later. For one example, American studies folks have used to follow and tend to follow historical periodization, but in my view, they no longer do. And so Gilded Age and Progressive Era means a lot less in American studies, for instance, and that's pretty closely allied of a field. Philosophy doesn't periodize this way, right? Religious studies doesn't even consider this sort of periodization. This is too short of a temporal period. So again, we can go down a lot of this, but in terms of interdisciplinary work, then how do we talk? How do we have conversations about a similar era when other scholars aren't periodizing even remotely close to this? And then you think about all the other kind of dissimilarities in the ways in which we study periods, what we think about, whether we use theory, what are our texts and core examples and that sort of thing. So I think that presents a lot of challenges. There's a lot of great constructive frictions that can come out of interdisciplinary work, but it is a little bit hard, in my view, for us to be in conversation because of how differently we think about the period itself, or don't.
Yeah, I think that's really, you really put your finger on something. And I think one of the things that I've been thrilled about is we have two excellent co-editors of our co-editors of our journal, and they are really working to override this and, reaching out to people saying, hey, I see you do this work in Native American history or, cultural studies or whatever it is. And, you may not realize it, but you are, a scholar of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and let us highlight your work. And, that, it will really help to us to expand the message of our journal and our period. So, but again, that's still pretty wonky. We're still talking to scholars. And I think, and I don't know how else you're going to get over this huge problem that Chris is describing, but I think that's at least one of the efforts that I see going on that gives me some hope.
Well, not to be funny, but my hope is that the podcast goes some way to bringing disciplines together and bringing people to the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era and reading the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. So I don't often have a call to action at the end of these shows, but I think one of the things I would ask listeners to do is check out the journal, check out the society, because if you are listening to the show and you've made it all the way through this 50 minutes of conversation on what is a sort of inside ball topic, I think you would find the society and the journal of great interest. Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.